drove a 2009 Chevy Silverado to the courthouse that morning. It had a crack in the passenger side mirror and one of the back windows wouldn't roll down all the way. I'd been meaning to fix it for 2 years. Never got around to it. My son noticed. He was 12, standing on the front porch when I came out, watching me load a single manila folder into the cab like I was heading to a dentist appointment. "Dad," he said. "That's it? Just one folder?" "That's it." He looked at the truck. Then at me. I was wearing dark jeans and a collared flannel shirt I'd bought at Costco the winter before. I hadn't shined my shoes. I hadn't even thought about it. "You look like you're going to Home Depot," he said. "I know." He didn't say anything after that. He just watched me pull out of the driveway, and in the rearview mirror I could see him standing there with his arms crossed, his expression somewhere between worried and confused. He was too young to understand what was about to happen. That was the point. I should tell you a little about the 8 years before that morning. I married my wife when I was 43. She was 38. We met at a mutual friend's cookout in Raleigh. She was a paralegal, sharp and funny, the kind of person who makes everyone in the room feel like she's paying attention specifically to them. We dated for a year, got engaged, moved into a house in Cary that she picked out and I paid for. I didn't mind. I was in love with her, and at the time I thought that paying for things was the same as taking care of someone. What I didn't tell her, not right away, not for a long time actually, was what I did for a living. I worked, at the time we met, as a systems integration consultant. That sounds boring. It is boring to explain. But what it meant in practice was that I had spent the previous 12 years building and selling software platforms to mid-sized logistics companies, and I had done well enough at it that by the time I was 41, I had sold my second company to a private equity firm for just under $31 million. I was not flashy about it. I never had been. I drove used trucks, wore clothes from Costco and Target, kept a small savings account at a local credit union for day-to-day expenses, and moved the bulk of my assets into a private investment trust that my attorney had helped me structure before I was 40. I lived on distributions from that trust. A modest amount, enough to cover a normal life without touching the principal. I didn't hide this from my wife out of deception. I want to be clear about that. In the beginning, I simply wasn't ready to have that conversation. I'd been through enough bad situations. A business partner in my 30s who started treating me differently the moment he found out my net worth. A woman I dated before my wife who started talking about houses in Napa on our third date. To know that money changes things, I wanted to know that what we had was real before I complicated it. And then the years went by and the conversation never happened. It wasn't malicious. It was just, I don't know how to explain it except to say that after a while the silence becomes its own kind of habit. She knew I had some money saved. She knew I didn't work a 9-to-5 anymore. She thought I did occasional consulting work, which was true. She thought our income came from that, which was not true. She never asked direct questions and I never volunteered the specifics, and somehow we built 8 years together on top of that gap. I know how that sounds. I've thought about it a lot since then. Our son was born in year 3. He was the best thing that ever happened to me. I named him after my father, who had passed 2 years before he was born. A man who drove a mail truck for 28 years in Fayetteville and never once complained about it. I wanted my son to have that name. I wanted him to carry something from that man, even though he'd never get to meet him. By year 6, my wife and I had stopped being good to each other. I don't want to assign blame here. Marriages fail for complicated reasons, and ours was no different. We fought about time, about attention, about the fact that I wasn't ambitious enough for her, that I didn't care about the right things. She wanted to move to a bigger house. I said the house we had was fine. She wanted to join a country club. I said I didn't see the point. She started spending more time with her colleagues after work. I started spending more time with my son. By year 7, I'd moved into the guest room. By the time she filed for divorce, I wasn't surprised. I was sad, not for myself, but for our son. He was 9 by then, old enough to know something was wrong, old enough to feel it in the air at dinner, even when neither of us said a word. She hired an attorney named Bradford. I'd seen his name on billboards in the area. He was known for aggressive divorce litigation. She told me about him the same week she served me with papers, in a tone that suggested she expected me to be frightened. I was not frightened. I called my own attorney that same afternoon. She was a woman I'd worked with for 15 years. A quiet, meticulous woman who had helped me structure my trust and had handled every piece of legal business I'd had since I was 37. I told her what was happening. She was quiet for a moment. "What does your wife think you're worth?" she asked. "Maybe 200,000. A car, some retirement savings, the equity in the house." Another pause. "And what are you actually worth?" "You know what I'm worth." "I want to hear you say it. A little under 28 million, after the house and the vehicle and the savings accounts." She made a sound I can only describe as professional satisfaction. "Okay," she said. "Here's what I want you to do. Don't correct her. Don't say a word. Let Bradford build his whole case on what she thinks is true." "You're sure about that?" "Martin," she said. She always called me by my first name when she was about to say something important. "Wait, I mean, she called me by my name. I'll use the right one. Ted," she said. "I've been waiting 6 years for someone to try this. Let me work. Let me tell you what Bradford built his case on. My wife and her attorney were seeking primary physical custody of our son, with limited visitation for me. The financial argument was straightforward. I earned, according to my last 3 years of tax returns, approximately $44,000 a year from consulting work. The house we lived in was worth about $600,000. She wanted it. She wanted child support commensurate with what she believed my income to be. She wanted, in short, everything she thought was there to take. In her version of events, I was a man of modest means who had coasted through our marriage, who lacked direction and ambition, who had failed to provide the kind of life she deserved. She wasn't wrong that I had been quiet about my finances, but the story she had constructed from that silence was something she had chosen to believe, and Bradford had sharpened it into a legal instrument. I did not hire a second attorney. I let my attorney handle the background work, the filings, the documentation, the trust records, and I showed up to the preliminary hearing myself. Bradford saw me walk in and his expression shifted just slightly. I was wearing the same flannel shirt I'd worn to drop my son at school that morning. I was carrying my one manila folder. He leaned over to my wife and said something, and she laughed. A short, sharp sound that bounced off the tile floors of the courthouse hallway and hit me right in the chest. I kept walking. Inside the courtroom, I sat down on my side of the aisle and placed my folder on the table and folded my hands on top of it. The hearing was scheduled for 45 minutes. A routine preliminary to establish the basic facts before the full proceedings. Bradford came in with 2 associates in a rolling briefcase. I had 1 folder. He noticed. He made sure I noticed that he noticed. The judge was a woman in her early 60s, the kind of person who has seen so much in a courtroom that nothing seems to reach her face anymore. She reviewed the case files, adjusted her glasses, and asked both parties to state their names for the record. Bradford stood and gave his name and firm. His 2 associates gave their names. My wife gave her name. Then the judge looked at me. "And you're representing yourself today?" "Yes, Your Honor." She looked at me over her glasses for a moment, not unkindly. "Just measuring. Your full legal name for the record, please." I said it clearly. First name, middle name, last name. The court clerk stopped typing. She looked up. The judge's expression didn't change, but her eyes went very still. She looked down at the file in front of her, then back at me. Then she looked at Bradford. Bradford was frowning at something on his legal pad. He leaned over to one of his associates, who pulled out a laptop and started typing quickly. My wife had not noticed any of this. She was straightening the papers in front of her with the focused attention of someone who has already decided how the afternoon is going to go. Bradford's associate turned the laptop toward him. I watched Bradford read whatever was on the screen. I watched his face change. It is a specific kind of thing to watch a man understand that he has made a significant error. The realization doesn't announce itself. It arrives in the face slowly, like weather moving across a field. First a tightening around the eyes, then something careful happening to the mouth, and then a stillness that is not confidence, but its opposite. He leaned over to my wife and said something very quietly. She pulled back and looked at him. He said it again. She turned and looked at me for the first time since I'd sat down, and in her expression I saw something I recognized. It was the same look I'd seen on the face of my former business partner when he found out what the buyout number was. A recalibration. A sudden and unwelcome revision of everything she thought she knew. The judge asked Bradford if he was ready to proceed. There was a pause that lasted a beat too long. "Your Honor," Bradford said, "I may need to request a brief continuance to review some newly identified." "We're on the record, Counselor," the judge said. "Proceed." What happened in that courtroom over the next 3 hours is difficult to compress into something short, but let me try to explain the shape of it. The trust my attorney had established held the vast majority of my assets. It had been structured as an irrevocable trust, meaning once the assets went in, they were no longer technically mine, in the legal sense that matters in divorce proceedings. They had been placed there 11 years earlier, well before my marriage, before I met my wife, before any of this. The trust had its own tax ID number. It filed its own returns. I was a beneficiary, not an owner. Bradford had built his entire financial case on my tax returns, which showed only my consulting income. He had not discovered the trust. Either he hadn't looked hard enough, or he hadn't thought there was anything to look for. My wife had told him I was a man of modest means. He believed her and built accordingly. When the judge asked me directly whether I had any assets beyond what was disclosed in a petition, I answered honestly. I explained the trust. I explained when it was established. I handed the judge the documentation my attorney had prepared, the full trust records, the dates, the asset valuations. Bradford objected. Several times. His objections had the sound of a man trying to plug holes in a wall with his fingers while the water keeps rising. The judge was thorough. She asked methodical questions. She was not impressed by Bradford's objections, and she was not impressed by my flannel shirt, and she treated both of us with the same level of dispassionate attention, which is exactly what I had hoped for. What emerged over the course of those 3 hours was this. My wife's petition had been built on a financial picture that was approximately 14% of the actual one. The trust assets, predating the marriage, were not subject to division. The house equity and the joint accounts were. Bradford's child support calculations were based on my consulting income. When he was forced to recalculate based on trust distributions, the number changed substantially in my wife's favor, not mine, which I had already known and already accepted, because that was never the part I was fighting about. I was fighting about my son. My wife's attorney had argued that my modest income and apparent lack of professional ambition made me a less stable custodial parent. That argument collapsed the moment the trust records were entered. Stability, as it turned out, was not my problem. The judge awarded me primary physical custody, not because of the money. I want to be careful about that. The custody determination was based on a longer record, school pickup logs, pediatric records showing who brought him to appointments, teacher statements. The fact that I had been present for his life in a specific and documented way that Bradford had not anticipated and had not prepared to counter because he'd been focused on my bank account. The money just removed the one argument they had for why I shouldn't have him. My wife cried when the ruling came down. I didn't feel good about that. Whatever else had happened between us, she was his mother, and this was the worst day of her adult life, and I knew that. Bradford gathered his materials with the quiet efficiency of a man who was already calculating how to explain this to his client in the parking lot. I sat in my chair until the courtroom had mostly cleared. The clerk, the woman who had stopped typing when I said my name, looked over at me as she was gathering her things. "I recognized it," she said. "From the SEC filings." I nodded. "Nobody knew you were involved in that company," she said. It wasn't a question. "Very few people," I said. She nodded once, picked up her things, and walked out. My son was on the front porch again when I got home. He stood up when he heard the truck in the driveway. I don't know how long he'd been sitting there. I parked and got out, and he came down the steps and stood in front of me with his hands in his pockets. "Well," he said. "You're coming with me," I said. "This is home." He nodded like he'd already known that and was just waiting to hear it. Confirmed. Then he looked at my shirt. "You really wore that." I did. He thought about it for a second. "Grandpa would have done the same thing," he said. I looked at him. He'd never met my father. I'd told him stories over the years, the mail truck, the uniform, the way the man went about things quietly and without performance. I hadn't realized he'd been listening the way he apparently had. "Yeah," I said. "He would have." We went inside. I made sandwiches for both of us because it was past lunchtime and neither of us had eaten. We sat at the kitchen table and he asked me to explain what happened, and I did. The parts that were appropriate for a 10-year-old, the parts that made sense to tell him. He listened with the focused attention he always gave, things that mattered to him. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment, turning his sandwich around in his hands. "So the whole time," he said, "you knew when they didn't know you knew." "That's more or less right. Why didn't you just tell them?" "It's a fair question. I've thought about it more times than I can count. Why didn't I correct her earlier in the marriage? Why didn't I tell Bradford before the hearing? Why didn't I walk in with a $300 suit and a briefcase and make it easy? The honest answer is that I didn't want easy. I wanted true. I wanted the outcome to be based on who I actually was. A man who showed up to his son's school plays and his pediatric appointments and his soccer games. A man who drove an old truck and wore flannel shirts. A man who happened to have money in a trust, but whose life was not defined by it. Not on how impressive I could make myself appear in a courtroom. I'd watched people perform their whole lives. I'd watched my ex-wife perform our marriage, and I'd watched Bradford perform competence in a room where he had none. And I'd watched the whole legal system brace itself for a fight that was going to be a lot simpler than anyone expected. I didn't want to perform. I just wanted to be honest about what mattered, I told my son. He thought about that. "But you didn't tell them about the trust," he said. "Isn't that kind of not honest?" He's 10. He asks questions like that. "I didn't lie," I said. "I just didn't correct assumptions people made about me. There's a difference." He chewed his sandwich. "Maybe," he said. He's probably right that it's more complicated than I made it sound. Most things are. That was 3 years ago. My son is 13 now. He's taller than his mother and has started asking questions about investing that I'm not quite ready for, but am doing my best to answer. We still live in the same house in Cary. I still drive the Silverado, though I finally fixed the back window. My ex-wife and I have found a kind of working arrangement. We are not friends. We are not enemies. She sees him every other weekend and some holidays, and she shows up when she says she will, and she is good to him when she does, and I have chosen to focus on that. Bradford has not been on any more billboards that I've seen. I don't know if that's related. I think about my father sometimes when I'm getting dressed in the morning. The mail truck, the uniform, the way he went to work the same way every day for 28 years without making it into anything larger than it was. He understood something that took me most of my adult life to figure out, that the quietest people in the room are not always the ones with the least to say. I wore a flannel shirt and drove a cracked truck to one of the most important days of my life, and I brought one folder and I told the truth and my son came home with me. I didn't need to make it anything more than that. I've thought a lot about what it means to let someone be wrong about you. Not forever, just long enough for the truth to matter more than the correction. Bradford walked into that courtroom with a rolling briefcase and 2 associates, and 8 years of assumptions my wife had handed him. He didn't check them. Why would he? I looked exactly like what she'd described, a man of no consequence in a flannel shirt, carrying one folder. When people are given a story that confirms what they want to believe, they stop looking for the one that doesn't. That's not cynicism, that's just how it works. People build their cases on the information in front of them, and they stop digging when the picture looks complete. Bradford saw a $44,000 a year consultant with an old truck and no attorney, and he thought the work was already done. My wife had spent 8 years not asking certain questions and had arrived at a version of me that was easier to leave. They were both operating on what they'd chosen to see, and here's what I've come to understand about that. The consequences of seeing people wrong are real, and they are yours to carry. Not because the universe punishes dishonesty in some dramatic cosmic way. I don't believe in that kind of accounting. But because decisions built on false foundations collapse under their own weight. Bradford didn't lose because he was arrogant. He lost because he was careless, and carelessness in a courtroom costs you. My wife didn't lose her case because she had mocked me. She lost because she had never once looked closely enough at the life we shared to understand what was actually in it, what I had built quietly over 20 years, the companies, the trust, the financial structure that was the product of a specific kind of patience, not the patience of waiting for things to happen, the patience of doing the work without needing anyone to witness it. My father drove a mail route in Fayetteville for nearly 3 decades. He was never on a billboard. Nobody at a cocktail party asked him what he did with admiration in their voice. But he raised a son who understood that competence doesn't require an audience, and that turned out to be the most useful thing anyone ever gave me. My son asked me that afternoon why I hadn't just told him about the trust, about the money, about who I actually was. And I told him there's a difference between lying and not correcting assumptions. That's true. But the fuller answer is this. I wanted the outcome to come from what was real. I wanted the judge to see a man who showed up to his son's life, not a man who showed up with an impressive balance sheet. The money removed an obstacle. It didn't build the case. 14 years of school pickups and pediatric appointments and Saturday mornings built the case. The trust just meant they couldn't take him from me on a technicality. That's the thing about living quietly and doing right by the people who depend on you. It accumulates. You don't see it happening day to day, but when the moment arrives that actually counts, it's all there, documented, witnessed, real, not as a performance, as a record. I think about my son's face on the porch that evening, that look of quiet confirmation when I told him he was staying. He wasn't surprised. He'd known all along who showed up for him. Kids always know. They're watching us more carefully than we realize, cataloging the small decisions, deciding who we actually are. The flannel shirt, the one folder, the cracked window I'd been meaning to fix. None of that was strategy. It was just my life, and it was enough.